Hello everyone, my name is Jim Watterston and I'm the Dean of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. I'd like to start our session this afternoon by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands upon which we all come together from and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to welcome our panellists and all viewers to this second episode of the MGSE webinar series, Propelling Education Through a COVID-19 World. This is the second of 4 episodes that are running on Tuesday afternoons at 4 o'clock over the next few weeks, and you'll be aware that last week we had a presentation from Professor Yong Zhao, which was viewed by 500 people, and so we're looking forward to having a similar audience tonight. This series will be recorded and posted on our MGSE YouTube channel. So it's available, and we've had many people access last week's already, so feel free to mention this to your colleagues. And of course, you can ask questions on the Q&A function on the webinar and join the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag MGSE, all in capital letters, and then the word Propel, P-R-O-P-E-L. So today's episode is titled, What Skills and Resources Will Students Need to be Agile and Thrive as they head into the world? And this will be presented by our MGSE eminent academic, Professor Sandra Milligan. Sandra is the Director of the Assessment Research Centre at the Graduate School. She trained as a science and mathematics teacher and was also a former Director of Curriculum in the Western Australian Education Department when very young principals like myself were very scared of her innate knowledge around curriculum, and ended up being much better principals than they were ever going to be because of Sandra. So we welcome her now today to contribute her education knowledge along with her academic thinking around this topic. Sandra is joined by Professor Yong Zhao, as I said, who presented last week. Education leaders must reconsider the way we teach and learn. He set the big picture, which now over the next 3 weeks we'll fill in some of that detail. Yong is our newest professor at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and it's been a great asset to all of us to have him amongst our ranks. And of course, we've also got Laureate Professor John Hattie with us today, and everyone's familiar with John's international work on visible learning. But I guess from my perspective, what I think is unique about John is the fact that there is no better academic across the world that can translate education research into practical application. And I think all of us who have worked in schools have benefited from John's expert knowledge and thinking around the way that we can improve outcomes for all young people. And of course, we have our graduate school's newly appointed Assistant Dean of Indigenous and a Senior Lecturer in Indigenous Education, Dr. Melita Hogarth, and we welcome you along today, Melita. Melita's been with us for some time now and made a really strong impact at MGSE, and we're looking forward to her contribution today. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to our expert moderator, and she also liaises as our Deputy Dean, someone who's indispensable around the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, Professor Janet Clinton. So it's all yours, Janet.
Thank you, Jim. And once again, it's really exciting to be here. As we discussed last week, this webinar series is designed to promote our thinking about education for the future. This pandemic has actually forced us to consider what the new world may look like. And what we're hoping is this webinar series will support us in propelling some new ideas and perhaps a focus on a really positive, impactful future. Similar to last week, what we're going to do is ask our education expert to talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, followed by a series of comments and questions from the other panellists. And as you heard, Melita will join us to provide comment and then take questions from the audience. So please remember, send your comments in and questions in, which we're going to continue to collate, because these will form the basis of our 4th and final episode. Our speakers are all working at home. And so please excuse any troublesome internet whether it's slow, etc. And I promise to all of you who were concerned about the pups last week, they are very happily turned down and just munching on a big bone. Last week, we got a number of comments and questions that we've started to collate. The results really added some interesting ideas and focus. Much of that collation will go on our reflection page on the MGSE website, so you'll be able to see what kind of questions were being asked, and we're just going to use all of those and the questions from the YouTube recording, again, to focus on that 4th episode. What was key from last week was that many people agreed that the view that we heard from Yong was really hard to argue with, arguing that our students should be the centre, they should have a voice. And in fact, some said, we've heard all this before. So the big question was, how do we do it? How do we get our students to be at the centre? The great theme was, it's all about change, and how do we bring about change? And most people wanted to understand how we change, for example, for teachers, what changes we might see in the systems in our schools, and of course, universities. The idea that change has been prefaced, this kind of change has been prefaced before by lots of data and lots of debate. What we heard last week is we've not actually managed to achieve that kind of change. Another thing that was interesting from last week is the comments really wanted to focus on achievement or assessment of achievement and how better to do it. In fact, 25% of the comments related to assessment. And several folks really wanted to understand not only how we see our learners developing, and how do we actually develop this learner profile? And if we do develop a learner profile, how would we assess it? And I think that actually brings us to Sandra's webinar today. Sandra last week shocked us a little bit in the middle of the webinar by suggesting she wanted to change her topic to what needs to be done now to fix the fact that many, and in fact, and I quote, most students don't get what they need to thrive. So Sandra, I'm going to turn to you, and perhaps you can explain what prompted you to suggest this. And I'm really still very keen to hear what you think students need to be agile and to thrive in a future new world. Sandra, over to you.
Thanks, Janet. Just to follow up on what you said, I have been privileged over the last couple of months to be part of a project where we listened to a large number of young people who were talking about their futures and talking about how well schools had fit them for that. Now, we were all in COVID lockdown. These were all young people who were just about to leave school or who had left school in the last year or two. They were all facing an uncertain future. They were all facing an uncertain present. And we got them in the room and said, well, to what degree did your 12 years of schooling fit you for what you're doing now and what you expect to be doing in the near future? I think you can possibly imagine what they said, but let me just give you a few headlines. First of all, they were almost unanimous in saying that what they had learned at school was far too narrow to set them up for the life that they were living now and the life they expected to lead in the future. It was dominated by academics and by narrow, they call it narrow subject focus. So they felt that that was a major problem. They also spent a lot of time talking about how and when they'd learned the things that they really valued And they mentioned often the part-time work that they had out of school hours, or the community groups that they were part of, or the supplementary education programs that they were part of. And they talked there of the types of knowledge and know-how, the attitudes, the values, the skills, the confidence that they got through those methods that they feel they did not get at school, that was really valuable for them, setting them up for what they saw to be their future challenges. The most critical comment they saved for our assessment and credentialing system, which is obviously, as Director of the Assessment Research Centre, sort of key to my heart. They were dismayed and beyond about the degree to which, at the end of their 12 years of schooling, the assessments and credentials that they were presented with gave them a number, or at best a group of numbers, on their secondary school certificates that they felt went no way towards explaining who they are, what they know, and what they could do. And they felt that this was a very pale representation that they would have to take to recruiters, to selectors, to their grandma, to whoever they wanted to show what they'd achieved. And more importantly, for themselves, because it didn't give them that sense of breadth and confidence, and they felt it didn't reflect what they know how to do, or who they are. Perhaps unsurprisingly, that theme that came through so strongly from those young people was also referenced in our most recent reports that are looking at this question, the Shergold report and the Masters report in New South Wales. They say the same thing, just in more moderate language. So from that, I draw the conclusion, it's been reinforced, that we do not really give students the knowledge and the know-how, the attitudes, values and skills, and more importantly, the confidence and creativity that they need to go forward with their lives. When it comes to trying, Janet, to your questions about what can we do about it and what skills do we need to look at, I think I need to tell people that I take my inspiration not, John, from the research evidence and not from the policy directors, the directions that come through from government, but at the moment I'm taking my inspiration very strongly with the group of partners, research partners, that we at the MGSE are working with to work through these issues. I call them the first movers in a new generation of education. Let me give you a few examples. The Latrobe Valley Authority came to us because they had a problem that the new employers in their region could not find, they believed, people who had the skills and abilities to be employed in their businesses. So the Latrobe Valley said, we need to fix this. What do you need? The employers said, well, we need problem solvers, communicators, collaborators, people who will work with us to solve things that happen. The Latrobe Valley says, well, a lot of people have credentials here from schools and TAFEs and universities. Employers say, well, those credentials don't tell us who can do what about the things that we really think are important. So the Latrobe Valley, in conjunction with the local employers, got us to establish, we're working on this, putting together a series of micro-credentials to credential anyone who wants to take the assessments to show the degree to which they have these capabilities, regardless of what credentials they already have or do not have, so that employers can trust that those people can do it. Another organisation we're working with, Big Picture Schools, they have for the last 15 years operated a very innovative design for 15 to 18-year-olds who want to do an alternative kind of senior secondary education. They've worked on it with local universities and employers. It's well accepted in the region, but they want it recognised for what it is, which is a really high quality alternative to the HSC or the VCE or the IB. So they're working with us to pin down what it is about what their students come out with, the skills, abilities, knowledge, know-how, and who those students have become as a result of that, to put together a credential that will be as trusted as an HSC across Australia. We work with many schools as well who think that the general capabilities and skills like entrepreneurialism and capacity to work with other cultures, that these are very important, but they don't quite know how to assess them or credential them. So we're working with them to work out the assessment schemes, to work out the micro-credentials, to put together the learner profiles, so these schools will be able to, with confidence, represent to the students and to other stakeholders precisely what these students know and can do in this area. And look, I could go on because we work with up to 20 or 30 of these brilliant first movers who are tackling problems in their own context about how to give a better representation for a broader range of skills for their learners. And I have learned a lot from them over the last few years. And I just want to share a couple of things about the how that we've learned from them. The first thing that I've really learned is that I cannot overemphasize how important are the general capabilities, or whatever people like to call them. Some people call them general capabilities. Universities often call them graduate qualities or graduate attributes. Employers call them enterprise skills or employability skills. Others call them 21st century skills or transversal skills. But one of the things that I've learned from working with our first movers is that these skills, which are transferable, learnable, teachable, and accessible, these are the tools of trade for learners and for people who want to develop expertise in any domain and want high performance in any domain. So these are the core fundamental skills that students need regardless of the domain that they work in, whether they're going to be childcare workers or nuclear physicists, no matter what they're going to be, their learning will be powered by capacity to develop skills in these fundamental, transferable, general capabilities or learning skills. That realisation has grown on me as I've worked with all of these wonderful first movers who are trying to get the best deal for their learners in their own environment. The second thing that I've learned is that it really takes time, that each of these organisations has had strong leadership over a number of years, totally committed to getting this sort of schema, this broader definition of success in a way that it can be recognised and assessed and demonstrated to everyone who's interested. I guess I sort of will probably, as a concluding comment, say that what I think this all adds up to, this is probably, this is a big call, is a generational shift in what I call the grammar of schooling. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term, grammar of schooling. It came from an article, I bet John knows the date, in the 90s by Tobin and Tyack, where they were lamenting why does the more education changes, the more it stays the same at fundamental level. But my view is that having watched these first movers and having looked at how the general capabilities are being addressed in their environments, that this is the potential to be a generational shift in the grammar of schooling. And why I say that is this, that when it comes to assessment, if you're talking about teaching and learning the general capabilities, you cannot stay to the standard assessment methods of standardised tests and invigilated examinations using pencil and paper or digital equivalent, essays and short answers. You just cannot. You need to shift to a rich developmental approach to assessment, where you're putting kids where they are on a developmental trajectory in complex competencies, using performance-based assessments and judgment-based assessments as well. The assessment has to fundamentally change. In addition, the credentials need to fundamentally change as well. It's no longer good enough to represent what students know and can do with a number, or even on a VCE, 8 numbers, which purport to say what a student knows and can do and who they are. The standards need to change. We can no longer say that a school is doing a great job if it gets 50% of its students above 90 ATAR and they all get up to level X in the NAP plan. That's not enough, because what we need to be doing is finding metrics and standards that can reflect where students are up to on these broad definitions of success and help them move along. Underneath all of this, the other thing that necessarily changes is the design of the teaching and learning that we provide to support these students. So again, you know, one teacher, one class, lockstep progression through a syllabus is not going to cut it when to learn the general capabilities, to become skilled in these. What students need are things like fuzzy challenges, I've heard them called, which may not actually have a solution, that require collaboration between kids, who require that teachers stand back and let them make mistakes and find their way forward, and to have agency. They need curriculum that's really engaged with their own interests and passions. And so this is a big shift. So the more I've worked with these first movers, the more I've discovered that as you go down this direction, you really do get major shifts. They take time, they take the mindset changes in teachers. When I talk about it, I've now slipped into a shorthand, and I say what we need is new assessment, new standards, new credentials. And that's really what it's all about. And that, to my mind, are the fundamental things that we need to teach students so that they can cope in a post-COVID world. Janet, I might just stop there because others might like to have a word.
Sandra, what I heard you talking about was revolution. I mean, really thinking at a teacher level, at a policy level, at a research level. And again, I suspect that some of our participants are going to go, well, how do we do it? I'm a lone teacher. And what about the evidence? And I would imagine at this point, John, you're probably chafing at the bit to have a comment about what Sandra is talking about. So could we ask you to come in and perhaps make a comment and see if you've got a question for Sandra?
Oh, Sandra, It is a revolution, new assessments, new curriculum, new teaching. The current system, and I am going to mention the four-letter word, ATAR, is very much where we construct a ruler from 1 to 100 and we place the kids along it. And it serves a purpose for those highly competitive university courses. It has been then sold as a purpose for other students who probably may not want to go on to necessarily those highly competitive courses. So what I'm hearing you saying is that one size fits all is a major problem. And what I hear you saying is you want to certify kids on the basis of what they can do, who they are, what actually their skills and talents are. And absolutely, I can see merit in that. I was a participant in another country 20 years ago when they abolished schools being the selection houses for universities. And they said, we're going to certify what you do. And so having been through that, they introduced a micro-credentialing system. And it led to absolute chaos in the first few years, which I'm sure we can learn from. Because one of the things that went is often students don't know what they don't know. And many of them, as we can show here in Australia with the ATAR's demise for a lot of university entrants, kids are not taking on the challenging subjects anymore. They're taking on what you said, their passion and their interests, which may not be necessarily their passions or their interests if they've been exposed to other precious knowledge, other precious things. And so I'm putting to you, you want a revolution, but what's wrong with students who want to go into highly competitive courses and want to do certain kinds of subjects? Why can't you have a bit of both? Why can't you have that kind of system? Because it does certify them. So before you do the revolution, do you want to react to that?
Yeah, sure. Look, I don't think I'm a revolutionary. I don't sort of self-reference on that. And on the ATAR, John, I just want to make a couple of points. The ATAR, I mean, I was around when the ATAR was introduced, and it was introduced for really, really good reasons. And that was to provide a fair and equitable way to regulate the entry to university. And believe it or not, I still think we need something like that, because the very worst thing we could have is a sort of law of the jungle approach where it's every kid for themselves or every school for themselves to get the best or, you know, the positions that are most sought after. So had I had maybe half an hour instead of 15 minutes, what I would have said is, I think that one of the big responsibilities in this change is for system authorities and organisations like ATAR, even perhaps AITSL, to come up with the national frameworks that make sure it's not a free-for-all and make sure it's not chaos. Most of the first movers that we work with do not want to always be on their own. They want the security of national moderation. One of the jobs that we're doing at the moment is working for the Commonwealth Department to develop a capabilities framework for the tertiary sector. Now, I think you can establish capabilities frameworks, moderation agreements, standards, and all of those sorts of things that we are very used to for subject-based assessments. They can be instituted for other sorts of assessments, and most of my first movers that we work with want something like that. And one of the frustrations is that the system is slower than the first movers, almost inevitably. So I think that that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is I don't want to see the ATAR removed until we've got something better in its place. Now, however, I don't think the ATAR is very good even for those kids who appear to thrive under it. When I talk to some of our colleagues at Melbourne who get to choose the brightest and best as measured by an ATAR. What they tell me is, well, you know, it's funny, the kids who get 99 on ATAR don't always make the best doctors. The kids who get 98 and go into teaching often don't make the best teachers. So that if there was a better way to regulate that sort of interface that really did capture all that students know and who they are, I think we would be better off, and we would get higher standards as well. So I don't buy, John, in summary, the chaos and low standards arguments that sometimes seem to attend micro-credentialing and general capabilities discussions.
I'll hand over to Yong.
All right, thanks. Well, when you guys are trying to make a revolution, I was just listening. This is fascinating. I could spend time arguing with you guys on the ATAR, but I'm not going to do that. I think one of the things I've been thinking a lot about regarding new assessment or new requirement of students is that not all the qualities we describe or the general capabilities we describe are clearly understood, and we actually don't know a lot of them. That's a very big problem. The second issue is that a lot of times, you know, when you require them as the most basic, that may be okay. But then when you look at the capabilities, sometimes they go against each other. They don't work with each other. You know, I'm actually, for example, I would say sometimes creativity does not necessarily correlate very well with academic performance. So we've seen that data, you know. And so they all, there could be other argument too, because also if you think about even academic subjects, you know, if you spend time on one subject, you can't spend the same time on the other subject. So there's also conflict. So one person can't be possibly great in the 4 C's or 6 C's or 10 C's, however many C's you can have. It's so there's, but there was a lot of times when, you know, all the capabilities have to be related to content, to knowledge. You know, you cannot have just that capability without certain content. And that content has to do with certain domains, certain subjects. So I was just wondering, in your thinking, Sandra, how do you take care of that individual differences? I'm the one who is always interested in individual differences. I mean, when you were talking about the 98 doesn't necessarily become a good doctor, or the 92 does not necessarily become, there may be some other very intricate connections of their knowledge, aptitude, capabilities, context. So how do you deal with that? You know, I know we won't be able to address all this issues. I just want to bring this out because when we talk about high standards, new assessment, new standards, we have this vision. We're creating something new for all children, for all students. I just don't think that's possible. Back to you.
Yeah. Well, Yong, as you would know, if you look at the academic literature, it's there's a lot of backwards and forwards, very little consistency, very little agreement about what these things are. Some people don't even think they're learnable or teachable. And that's one of the reasons why I say I take my lead from practice in this regard. There, you know, I'm very fond of saying there is no such things as general capabilities in the sense that they're like a table or a chair and they exist in the real world. They're things that we make up, that we throw a lasso around and say, there are certain human behaviours and we're going to call them, say, communication. And we can look at them, we can watch a person do it, and if we work hard at it, we can develop a progression because, you know, it's easy to say just in normal language, that person is a really terrific communicator and that person is not as good. Now, as soon as you can say that, you can start developing assessment instruments and work out whether you can actually reliably and validly capture that. Most of the people we work with say, yes, it is possible for teachers to put themselves in the position where they can observe a student doing things in a performance and make a reliable judgment of where they're up to on this progression of capability in these sorts of general capabilities. So we believe that we've shown evidence that teachers can do this if they've got the tools, and that employers believe in these things as well, because that's what they ask for when students turn up. So we believe on the evidence of it works that it is possible to do this. And so are the first movers that work with us. I don't pretend that we've got all the answers that will be thrown up over the next 10 years, but I do know that learners like to know about these things and like to know how they perform. Teachers are able to teach and assess, and employers and other stakeholders find it valuable. So just on those grounds alone, we're pressing forward. And, you know, they're fundamental to the Australian curriculum. They're a third of the Australian curriculum. They must be good.
Perhaps before we move to Melita, John or Yong, do you have any other comment?
I want to ask Yong's question one again, Sandra, specifically. These general capability skills are not transferable. They need to be taught within the context of precious knowledge. Do you agree or disagree? I think that's your question, Yong.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't agree with your statement. I think I will agree with you once we dig in further. This is what you cannot develop general capabilities independently of a particular domain or content area. However, I do believe that once you've developed a skill like communication or like critical thinking, that you have the wherewithal to be able to transfer that. So, for instance, if you're transferring critical thinking skills, say you developed them while you were a history student or a philosophy student, I believe, and I think there is evidence that you can take those skills with you into another domain. You won't immediately be expert at problem solving or critical thinking in that domain, but you have the infrastructure, the mental and skill infrastructure to apply that to another domain that stands you in good stead. When employers ring up referees and say, is this a good person? Is this a collaborative person? Do they work well with others? They are relying on the idea of transferability, but they know you can't just develop it in no context. So does that answer your question? That's where I'm coming from on this.
Well, thanks, John. That's one of the questions. Thank you for this is another issue I think I was really emphasizing is the idea that you know, in kindergarten, elementary may be okay, but when people really get to work, as we know in the future, right now, a lot of the jobs will be gone. We know that for sure. And a lot of them will be, when people really get to work, truly, I think what we want them is that individuals will have to have different capabilities. And so at K-12 level, a lot of the capabilities don't really go together. Some people are horrible communicators, but they're extremely creative. So how do you take care of that piece? How do you highlight the individual differences? And also, schools have very limited amount of time for teachers to work with students. We can't expect everyone to be A's in every domain. That's what I meant. So what do you think?
That's why you need a learner profile, Yong. I mean, we've developed a profile in the Assessment Research Centre for the general capabilities, that we call it a chrysanthemum, but it actually looks like the petals of a daisy, and each petal is meant to represent a construct that is of the classification general capabilities. It might be critical thinking and communication. And what we find, of course, is, as you say, everyone's got a different profile. You get some people who are fantastic communicators, but they're not very good at critical thinking. Some people are excellent at collaboration, but not so good on intercultural capability. My argument would be, of course, everyone has a jagged profile in almost everything they do. But if people know what their strengths and what their profile is like, then they're in a better position to chart A, their future learning, and B, a best match for where they're going to go. I mean, it would be terrible, would it not, if all the doctors were chosen who had no empathy for sick people, or an engineer was chosen who couldn't do critical thinking. I mean, they would be bad things, but you don't expect everyone to have everything.
So, Sandra, and I guess John and Yong as well, if I'm a teacher and I'm sitting back here, I'm thinking, this is really confusing because I've got a curriculum, I know what I've got to teach, I've got an assessment that tells me what I need to do. If I'm a policy maker, I've set the policies out, I know what needs to happen. All of us really, really are concerned with our individual students. I've heard you talk about the learner profile, but our students are all so different, and what I'm hearing feels a little chaotic. So I'm going to bring in Melita, because Melita, I think some of the things that you've been doing in your own work actually relates to the individual students and the diversity of our students as a whole. So Melita, could I ask you for a comment and perhaps a question? And then what we'll do is perhaps look at some of the questions in the chat and see if we can get Sandra and our panelists to come in and respond. Melita?
Thanks, Janet, and thank you, Sandra, for sharing your thoughts around general capabilities and the ways in which we can look at assessment. I guess I'm thinking even more broadly, and I hear the notion of success and it being problematized, and I'm encouraged by that kind of idea. You know, the notion shared last week by Yong that not all students work at the designated year level. Expectation was certainly not lost on me as someone who works within Indigenous education. You know, our kids, as in Indigenous kids, have struggled within the education system since being allowed to enter the Western classroom in the mid-1970s with this very idea that kids are expected to work at the same level. And in turn, that actually nullifies and devalues Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing. You know, our pedagogical approaches differ vastly to this notion of progressing without learning the skills necessary to do so beforehand. You know, in mainstream, it's shipping you through the system, and it's essentially setting up young people to fail. And so I think about the ways in which the education system is set up again within that notion of a neoliberal education system. And I wonder why these first movers that you speak about, Sandra, are considered alternative. I think about how COVID has really made visible the inequities in education and its flaws that were there previously, but have been highlighted because of COVID. And I wonder, well, no, I think about the ways in which politicians tell us as educators and teachers that we need to get back to basics, and wonder how they fail to see these inequities or consider the rigid and set conditions of education. And they can't see the innovative ways to look at education and that it's necessary if we are to prepare our students for a world of uncertainties. And that's my dog barking now. The need to deliver on 21st century skills, which I see as those general capabilities, you know, those humanistic qualities, as opposed to the disciplines and content that John was looking at. And it's considered this radical change of a revolution. But then I think about, for me, I'm reminded of my year 5 classroom teacher, Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, so I was in a small country town in Queensland, and I'm talking about the mid-1980s here, where for one whole year, education became fun and innovative. You know, as a class, we analysed and critiqued music as poetry. We became our own publishing company, where our creative writing was not simply just writing for writing's sake, but we wrote, we illustrated, we created our own books and lent them out to other classes. And we were encouraged to look at alternative lenses to recount and writing fractured fairy tales. But Mr. Smith was only at the school for a year. His ideas were too radical for the school and the community, and he was transferred elsewhere by the end of that year. But then I think about my own teaching degree experience. And so 10 years on from then, we were actually encouraged as English teachers to look at music as poetry and fractured, and looking at the protagonist and antagonist lens and so forth. So I guess with saying all that, my question would be, you know, and I've seen it within the Q&A that's coming up, particularly about policy and curriculum and the ways in which it's very structured and it's very, we're told what we have to do. It's, you know, the government architecture of Aitulakara, it's all very specific on telling teachers and taking away autonomy to an extent. And I guess the question really is, how can we shift these things? If the individual can be transferred out because they're too radical, how do we as a collective look to create change? You know, how can we shift things?
Thanks, Milligan. Again, I think that's a really good question. And, you know, I grieve for your Mr. Smith, but I grieve more for you and your class who lost Mr. Smith. And I would really like it if we had a whole pile more Mr. Smiths. And what I feel as though you're asking is how we can make more Mr. Smiths and make the system so that we can have teachers who inspire and encourage kids and actually get them to do the basics like literacy and numeracy, because that's what he was doing with you, reading and writing, and actually getting you to excel in that, engaging you to do it. So I understand the question. The answer, I think, is, well, again, I'm going to go back to my first movers, none of whom I think would describe themselves as revolutionary. What they would describe themselves as is having the same spirit as Mr. Smith, which is looking at the learners that they have and trying to work out a better way, a better success for them, where success is not just defined by the system. So what do I think it will take? Well, what I notice is that it does take time and local action and strong leadership in a particular community so that the whole school community develops a way of operating. So it's not something an individual teacher can do, but it's something that an individual teacher can be supported to work on over a period of years. I guess if I was going to point my finger at any groups at the moment, I would point it at the, and Jim, you'll no doubt come in on this, the education authorities, the curriculum authorities, probably the assessment authorities, for having the 20th century grammar of schooling embedded so deeply in the system that the costs for moving out and experimenting are too high. What school principal wants to experiment in years 11 and 12 when the wrath of the parents who know their students have to get high ATARs will descend upon them? What teacher is going to move away from the drilling of students on past examination questions if they feel it's going to cost kids a couple of rank scores? They can't do it. The view of assessment, the view of what a credential is so deeply embedded that we need to, the systems, I believe, need to create room for people to experiment. And seeing there are already lots of people doing it, I don't think that should be so hard. When I was a young teacher, well, who knows what you knew when you were a young teacher. You sort of can't tell what you knew and what you didn't know. But my impression very definitely was that the pressure for change came from the profession and the departments and the unions working together. At the moment, I don't detect I don't detect pressure from change, so that it's almost like every school is on its own. So in that, I look very positively to initiatives from ACARA to relook at the general capabilities. Let's hope we can move the grammar along a bit. I look very positively at the department, Commonwealth Department, doing a capabilities framework for tertiary education. Let's see if we can move the grammar along a bit. I look at the way lots of schools are taking up developmental assessment and formative assessment. That is a move in the right direction. So I'm seeing all these little shoots. I just think it needs to get some momentum behind it and some clarity that we do need to move to a new generation of grammar for schooling. And Melita, I know that doesn't answer your question, but that's as good as I can think of at the moment. It's the question that, as a profession, we should be looking at.
Jim, I see you wanting to jump in there.
Well, I don't know that I want to jump in, but I do want to respond, seeing as Sandra called me out. But, you know, I've been around school systems for a long time, and unfortunately, you call it the grammar of schooling, but we've been learning all the way through the last few decades to love the predictability of schools and school education. And, you know, John has used the term the politics of education. And so the predictability of schools is enjoyed by parents. Schools are like the school that they went to, so then it must be a good school. But I'll just give you one quick reference to the politics of education, because ministers these days like to sort of go with the trend and talk about the fact that you know, NAPLAN may not be a good thing because we're teaching to the test. Now, for the last 15 years, time of NAPLAN, I've been watching. Those ministers are the first to come out on the day after NAPLAN results and talk about the fact that their state is the best state in Australia because they've improved their NAPLAN results even when they haven't. And so we've got to fight the tide. And so everything that you've talked about today is music to, I'm sure, all of the viewers' ears, and the 400 or so people, I'm sure, are thinking, well, how can we turn the tide? And the way that we can turn the tide is to make a compelling case like we've made during COVID. Every single teacher believed that they had to find a new way of teaching during the COVID period when it was lockdown, because otherwise students wouldn't get taught. We had a willing coalition without even asking them to be a willing coalition. Now we need to apply the same thinking, the same sense of urgency, the same burning platform to some of these big issues about having more Mr. Smiths around and about letting teachers perfect the art of teaching instead of perfecting the art of rewriting curriculum documents. And so we really do need to focus on what the purpose of education is. And this would be a whole new sort of webinar that we have to do. So I'll give up now. But there are so many inherent problems that are holding us back when so many of us could form that willing coalition as we have done during COVID-19.
Thanks, Jim. We've got a little bit of time left, but I did want to ask Melita, are there any burning questions on our chat just a quick one that we could focus on before we finish? We've got a few minutes left.
There's heaps of questions. There's a lot that are talking about how the stuff that you're talking about, Sandra, is related, or they can see alignments to the International Baccalaureate and the idea about learner profiles. And some people have been asking, what are these profiles? But there's also been questions around, you know, how does this actually affect things like VCAL, or what do we do with VCAL? So I guess they are the sorts of questions that are coming up.
Oh, I'd love to spend some time on VCAL and VET and so forth, because there's no doubt about it that students' experience in the VET sector really adds something to the experience that they currently get in the academic school sector. So one of the policy directions that I feel we should be going, and there are several inquiries on foot in Victoria at the moment, is to make sure that when we're representing what students know and can do and who they are, we are inclusive of what they learn at school, what they learn in the VET sector through VCAL, and perhaps what they learn elsewhere as well, so that a learner profile actually represents the learner and what they do, regardless of whether they learned it in a secondary school, a VET college, or elsewhere. So I think the question about VCAL and VET is another really important one, where there's low-hanging fruit. There are wins to be made for students in that area, and I look forward to us working on it.
Thank you, Sandra. What I'm hearing from all of you is there is some thought that it's a really good thing to do. Still, the question's going to be, how do we do this? How does the policymaker do it? How does the individual teacher, what part do they play? What part do our students play? And certainly what schools and leadership might do. I wonder what this says about our evidence, because part of the thing that I heard was, if we think of this as a revolution, does the revolution mean that we throw things out of the window? I'm seeing people say we can't really get rid of ATAR. And Sandra, I heard you say, well, we can't have a free-for-all, so we've got to do something. Now, I wonder what this all says in the face of the evidence. I'm going to turn to John, because John, next week, we're going to hear from you, and you're raising this interesting topic, which is, are the days of evidence over? I'm not quite sure I know what that means, because I can't imagine a world in education without evidence. And if we are going to have this revolution in our new world, what kind of evidence do we need? So can you give us a hint to what you're going to talk about for next week? And really, are the days of evidence over?
Sure. And let me start by saying most of what Sandra was talking about, I absolutely have a lot of empathy for. The notion of certifying kids for what they can do makes a lot of sense to me. And Sandra raised the point that she didn't use that academic evidence, she used her practice people. I think that really opens a fascinating question about evidence. There is oodles of evidence out there. In fact, I haven't met a single person who doesn't stand up and talk about education and follow it with, and I have evidence. And so you've got to seriously ask about whether the days of evidence are over. And next week, I want to talk about that. I'm going to argue that the days of evidence are over. And we need to turn to the implementation of that evidence. We need to change the rhetoric from saying what works, because I think when it comes to teaching kids, almost everything works, to arguing what works best. How do we look for excellence? And there is lots of excellence out there, and you've named some that you're working with at the moment, Sandra. And how do we stop our policymakers and our principals looking for failure and finding a band-aid to fix it, as opposed to having the courage to identify success and upscaling that success? And I think one of the biggest problems in our business is courage. And I want to return to what Yong was talking last week and see, and you've raised this too, Jim, how this COVID has shown us how we can make dramatic changes in schooling almost overnight in terms of what's happened and how we can capture that and the notion of how we can do it. Because I come back to all these discussions about capabilities and 21st century skills, and if you go back and read Plato and Aristotle, they were talking about. So they're really 5th century BC skills. And when you think of 21st century skills, we're a fifth of the way through. We better get it right. Our kids today, their grandkids will be teaching kids in the 22nd century. So that discussion, I'm with you, Sandra, and I think that we have to do something reasonably quickly, and I can, if we change the discussion from saying, how do we talk about evidence to how do we implement it? So that's what I want to talk about next week, and I think it's happening now. We just need to scale it up faster.
Thanks, John. I think next week is going to be really interesting because what I'm hoping will happen from all of the discussions we're having, that these things will scaffold onto one another. And when we get you all in a room together, again, virtually, I'm hoping that we will have some answers for our teachers, our policy makers, and our school leaders. Where are we going with this? So, Jim, I think that's all for now. And I'm going to hand back over to you.
Great, thanks, Janet. Can I just acknowledge all of the audience members that joined us today? I thought it was a fascinating discussion, some great presentations from all of our speakers. And as I said at the start of this webinar today, that this recording will be available on our YouTube channel. So just go to the MGSE YouTube channel and you'll find this and last week's, and of course the next 2 weeks will also be put up there. We did get a lot of questions today, over 70, and we haven't forgotten them. We are going to collate them and bring them together for the last session if we haven't dealt with them prior to that. So don't feel like your questioning have been wasted. It will certainly serve part of the agenda for us at the end. Can I just thank Sandra in particular? I thought that was riveting. I can always tell the quality of the presentation by how quickly the time seems to go. I was just captivated, and I'm sure everyone else was. So Sandra, that was brilliant. Thanks, John and Yong, for your contributions and pushing the conversation further. It was fantastic. And Melita, you really grounded the conversation and brought some reality to that. And I thought your contribution was pivotal. So thank you very much. And of course, Janet, your moderation was fantastic. We look forward to being back here again same time next week when John will talk about other days of evidence over, which I'm glad he explained because I thought that was about the US presidential election campaign. So I'm glad to know it is about education. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you all.